Yeah, but I think the paint. Like I said, kids need.
Hey,
Fine.
welcome everyone to this local Water Done Well elected member briefing, where we will be discussing water services delivery plan and delivery model, and we'll be receiving an update. So I'll pass over to staff.
Morning, everybody. So today is the final.
Actually, Sean, sorry to interrupt, but before we go into the briefing, I forgot. Darren and I would just like to give a brief update about, for everybody's information, about a conversation that we've been having around a possible entity to the north, just so that that information is shared.
Thanks, Your Worship. Morena tātou. So during the first briefing, I think it was David Cochrane asked some questions about options for us, other than the Wellington regional model rather, or perhaps us by ourselves. So Tuesday morning, the Mayor and I met with Palmerston North City Council, Manawatu District Council and Horowhenua District Council to understand what options might look like. Obviously, it was a conversation with no committal. We don't have any delegations to commit us to anything, and we are still working through some options, and you'll see those in the conversation that we have with you this morning. So I guess the positive piece to take away is that we have options. People want us to be part of their, I guess, future water delivery model, whether it is to the south, to the north, in various models, or even by ourselves. And we saw a glimpse into what the viability of those looked like when Morrison Lowe talked to us at our first briefing. So really just wanted to share that with you. No surprises, as such, and make sure that you are on the journey with us. Anything that you want to add?
No, you'll see there's some info when we get to those slides on options, but no. So today is the third part of the trilogy of the three waters. This is the last briefing before you have to make a decision on the 28th, which is only in regard to staying in the process to head south. So that's the only decision that has a timeline associated with it. We talked about that at the last session. The other work, whether it's options of CCOs, business units, we need to be submitting a plan in advance of September, or by September the 5th or the 3rd, 2025, as to what we're going to be doing. And that's included. By that point we have to have done consultation on two options, and we have to gone through all those issues. And I guess one of the other things will come through a little bit today, and maybe the local LGFA was interesting this morning. That 500%. One of the reasons why everyone wants Kapiti to be part of their option is the scale. If your revenue is only $10 million, then you can only borrow up to $50 million. So if you can push the scale of that entity and you can push the revenue out, then you can also, obviously, you fit into a better model in terms of extent of how much you can borrow. So that's one of the key things, and certainly the Wellington regions and the metros and to the north as well. If a larger entity, more connections, more revenue, allows you to push closer to that 500% cap. And there's some numbers you'll see. We've done a bit of an analysis in terms of pros and cons that talk about financials and which ones sit within that and how that affects maybe some of the thinking post the 28th of November. and maybe at the end of today, at the session, we might talk about what more information you might need because we could potentially on the 28th, we've probably got enough or close to enough to give you a steer on a preferred option. But it would be useful today to maybe have that conversation as to, again, the level of comfort with the information that we've got and what you might also like us to do in advance of making that decision. So, and on that, I'll just hand over to Martin, and Ian should be along shortly, but we can probably cover all the financials anyway, yeah. Martin?
Down there. Morning. Kia ora. Martin Cole. So just walking through, I guess, the next bit of the briefing. Last briefing we talked about the work that Morrison Lowe had done, and what we've tried to do in this briefing is bring all of that information and the information from Dougal and the regional project into one package, if you like, to be able to walk through it and give some comparisons on some initial shortlisting on the options, and as Sean said, some pros and cons, just to give some sort of traffic light assessments of the different various options that are on the table. So we'll just do a one-page recap on the local water done well legislation. I'm sure you're very familiar with it, so we'll just hit the headlines on that. Just an update on the regional water service delivery plan project and the status of that currently. We'll look at the various different delivery models and a short listing of those. What's important to Kapiti? We've taken the feedback from the last briefing and revised those key items slightly in terms of what to compare against or what's important to Kapiti. We've done a quick short listing of the types of models, and we can go through that, and then also a high-level assessment of the detailed options.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, Madam Chair, I just wanted to check. We were due to start this at 11:30, and we don't have David Cochrane, Kim, Lawrence, and other people here as well who might have been thinking this was going to start at... Okay, well, they were an apology for the council meeting.
No, they're away.
Oh, okay, all right, no, I was just checking that allowance had been made for.
And Glenn's online.
Okay.
So I think we're good. Yeah, there'll be a recording of this available too. Yeah, there's a recording of this available too because it's being live streamed.
Okay. So just to recap, the second bill of the Water Services Act, Local Government Water Services Act, requires the delivery of water service delivery plan by the 2nd of September next year. In that, it has to have information disclosure about the current delivery models, so the assets, the financials, and regulatory performance of the water services, water, wastewater, and stormwater. It also has to have the proposed delivery model of council's water services going forward, and the timelines and implementation plan for delivering that, and council needs to give that effect. It also provides for a simpler alternative consultation process and decision-making methods. In relation to stormwater, there are some options in how stormwater would be delivered, but council ultimately retains the responsibility for the performance of stormwater. We have the Commerce Commission was introduced as the economic regulator, and they'll be working in the background currently developing up those economic regulations. And Te Mata Arawai's the Water Services Authority have had some of their powers strengthened, and also sitting in the background is the ability to appoint a minister, Crown facilitator, and specialist by the minister. There's more detail to come through on the specifics of all this information in the third bill, which we expect to see come out in December, that will set the detail of these various parts of the second bill. Just to reiterate, status quo is not an option with the new economic, environmental and water quality regulation coming in. There's new planning and accountability framework for water services, including standalone financial accounts, ring-fenced water supply, wastewater, stormwater. And again, in the third bill, there's more detail about what's required there. But in essence, the the water services delivery organisation will need to produce its own water services strategy, effectively similar to an LTP in a standalone model, and report back through its own requirements. Must be financially sustainable, and we'll talk a bit more about what that actually means in terms of sustainability of revenue, investment and financing. Must act consistently with statutory obligations, and there'll be more statutory obligations coming through in the third bill, so there'll be more detail about what those actually are over and beyond our environmental regulatory requirements that we have currently. And importantly, sitting in the Act is the restrictions on privatisation. That's very clear that that's a big component of this piece of legislation. Just to give a snapshot of where the regional project status sits, which was all the councils, including Greater Wellington Regional Council, ourselves and Horowhenua District Council, signed an MOU back in May to work on a regional water service delivery plan to examine what the best model would be for the region if it was to go that way. What was recommended was a full breadth council-owned utility company with ownership of the assets, revenues, liabilities as best for a region, principally around the challenges of delivering the backlog of renewals and upgrades that need to happen across the region. So far, the Wellington Metro Councils have all decided to stay with the Wellington regional approach. So that's Porirua, Upper Hutt, Lower Hutt, Wellington City, and also Greater Wellington Regional Council have decided to continue on with developing a regional model with a joint CCO, council controlled organisation. Masterton has opted to include that option in its consultation, and Carterton and South Wairarapa have exited the region with a preference to look at a Wairarapa option or a standalone option for themselves. Horowhenua has yet to decide, and obviously we're going through this piece of work currently. So that just gives you a snapshot of where everyone in that regional project is sitting at the moment. That is currently continuing on with starting to develop the framework for the water service delivery plan, the implementation plan, and there's work underway this month and next month on consultation documents for that project. So I guess that's the key decision for council on the 28th, is to remain in that process or look at other alternatives. That was quick. And in a nutshell, so I thought we'd come back to putting on a slide what Kapiti considers important in this decision, in making this decision. So relationships and trust certainly is high on the agenda in terms of water assets remaining in public ownership, and that is going to be baked into the legislation around protections for that to occur. Iwi and Māori having meaningful influence. We've shuffled a few of these around, and I've brought up into this one the ability to influence local priorities and build on the work that's been done to date in Kapiti. Clearly came through as a strong degree of importance in maintaining that local focus. In terms of meeting the regulatory requirements, financial sustainability for investment, revenue and financing arrangements, and also having gone through the work of, certainly with water meterings, that transparency and equitability customer charging is another key aspect for Kapiti. We've included in here the cost of service, so the average cost to customer, and this is just a measure across the total cost of providing a service divided by the number of customers. It's a rough, it's a guide in terms of what that impact is to the customers in any serviced area. And whilst it's not the actual price path necessarily, it gives a guide as to what the impacts of the different options look like. Levels of service, and in terms of actually turning on the tap and having safe, effective, reliable water and disposal of wastewater services and management of stormwater, making it efficient and effective water service delivery, so that's key, the actual impact and performance of the service on the ground to the customers. Maintaining a strategy or strategic view, responsive to future housing growth, clearly important to Kapiti and the growth that's happening and will happen. And then operationally making sure that there's a resilient operations model that it can weather change, and in any transition arrangements that they're fair and seamless for staff and council.
I've got, are we doing questions at the end?
Well, we could try them as we go, but we
You might.
don't have a huge amount of time. So if it does we get starting to get behind, we might have to stop and.
So is that particularly relating to this slide,
The
Shelley?
one before, and it was just
Yeah.
on the
go ahead.
boundaries. When we've got Greater Wellington, who's going to go into the south, but has water infrastructure and stuff in our region. How does that happen? No,
Greater
When-
Wellington don't have any water infrastructure in our catchment.
they manage water that affects
rivers.
our. Yeah. So how does that work? Because the Waikanae water treatment plant is from a river that's managed by.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so
Greater
no.
Wellington.
So
How does
as the
that-
consenting authority.
Yeah, they remain the consenting authority. Greater Wellington Regional Council is the only regional council in the country that used to or was providing drinking water. So they have they have a bulk water reticulation system and treatment plants that provides water for the Wellington metros. So that's what they're talking about when they talk about Greater Wellington being
Okay.
in. They're not in. None of the regulatory stuff.
As in our stuff.
No,
Okay,
that's all stays the same, and the river management is not part of. It's only stormwater, so it doesn't have an effect.
Okay. Should we move on? Thanks, Shelley. Good question.
So broadly looking at the delivery types that are coming through from the government's legislation, you've got the new council in-house business unit. So that's establishing a fully ring-fenced and resourced internal business unit to meet the changes and demands of the new regulatory environment. You've got council-owned service and advisory organisation. So this is something that would be similar to a Wellington Water type approach, where council still retains the ownership of the assets and provides the funding for that organisation, so doesn't actually hand over any of the assets. Council-owned, fully serviced asset owning organisation, so this is a full asset owning CCO model, and the options under that are council, Kapiti Coast doing a standalone CCO if you like, and then there's other multiple council options with Horowhenua, Manawatu, Palmerston North, and the Wellington Regional and Horowhenua. They're all joint multi-council CCO models. There was also the option of a consumer trust, either a mixed council and consumer trust or a full consumer trust ownership model that was on the table from central government as options.
Just a quick question with the, sorry to interrupt, with the second one, the service and advisory organisation, if the council still retains the assets, does that mean it's still bound by the 280% debt limit? So therefore you can't access the 500% debt limit?
Yes.
Yeah, okay,
Yes.
cool, thank you.
And just following on for what Cam was asking, and if it's not appropriate right now, and I've forgotten what I was going to ask, so I'll come back to it.
If it's on the financials, do we have financials coming up in the slides?
Yeah.
So we've got financials coming up in the slides, so it might come to you by then.
Yeah. Sorry, David, all you've missed is an intro, a bit of a quick recap on where things have got to. Martin's going to start now getting into more of the detail around options and things. Thanks.
Okay.
We started early. Sorry, David.
So looking at those various options, you've got the new in-house business unit. So the key advantage there is in terms of the ability to leverage council revenue for borrowings. So that keeps that financials within the council boundaries, retains control for the legislation. Council controls that entity, so that business unit would sit within council and operate similar to how it does currently. It would be ring fenced around its financials and also in terms of water, stormwater and wastewater. Some of the key disadvantages, it is constrained and has to rely on the council debt, so they are bundled in together. We'll talk a bit more about that shortly. There's no requirement for a competency-based governance board, as there would be with a CCO, and the question also remains in terms of scale and market attractiveness, both for staff and contractors. Looking at that, that is definitely an option that has benefits and one that would be recommended for shortlisting through. The advisory services only, and this is similar to the Wellington Water model currently, does allow for the benefits of scale. However, as you've picked up there, it doesn't allow access to the LGFA elevated lending debt to revenue ratios. It remains constrained by and attached to the council overall debt and revenue. And it doesn't have the ability to set the revenue independently. So that advisory services only is one that we wouldn't recommend for shortlisting through for consideration. The full service and asset owning CCO, again, allows for that benefit of scale. As you bundle more entities together, you increase your potential funding limits up to 500%, and there's the transfer of assets and liabilities. It does require an increase in revenue to meet those debt revenue limits, and there's an inability, actually, as the counter to that is the inability to leverage off council revenue and debt headroom. However, as an option for a CCO, that's and the various options either being standalone or other groupings, that's something that we'd recommend for shortlisting through for consideration. And then the consumer trust creates a direct relationship with the customer, with a customer trust. It's financially fully independent, and one of the key challenges there is that it doesn't have access to the LGFA funding and is exposed to the open lending market, and would take significant setup complexity and timelines to put in place. So that's recommending that that's not considered for further consideration.
Excuse me, would that be an equivalent type Electra type scenario?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep. I think Dan mentioned the other day that initial inquiries with Electra suggested that there wasn't an appetite to extend that into a water model or a water advisory model. If you took an Electra now and wanted to bolt on water services, it's not something that there was a high appetite for.
And we did look at it.
Yep. There's so if you take those forward, essentially your options become a new council in-house business unit, fully ring-fenced and resourced internal business unit, single council CCO, so that's Kapiti Coast Council CCO, so full service asset owning organisation, and also the joint councils, and there's a number of different options there that we've been looking at and working through with Kapiti Horowhenua, Manawatu and Palmerston North, and then there's the Wellington Regional and Horowhenua option as well. There was mention the other day from, is it Mike?
Mm-hmm.
From Simpson Greason, in terms of the referendum and how that might be dealt with. With the council in-house business unit, the option for a referendum is not required, isn't triggered. If you were to consider CCO options, then the option for referendum becomes a consideration as part of those options as well. And you heard from Mike the detail on that.
Yeah, we haven't got a slide, I don't think, that covers. So that previous briefing, the options around the referendum, there were options there to amend standing orders, to set them aside temporarily. There were some alternatives to the referendum, but they all related to either amending, removing, deleting the current standing orders and relying on the government's mandate to have to consult on two options, or obviously going out with a referendum.
So not that it precludes it, it's a consideration that needs to be put into the mix with a CCO option. And then in the next couple of slides, we've provided a bit more detail. This has come from the Department of Internal Affairs initial presentations on the different options in terms of the service models. I wouldn't propose to go through these in great detail because they're there for you to read, but enough to say that certainly with an in-house business model, council retains 100% ownership of the water services. It's governed by an internal business unit. It is held to account by the Commerce Commission and Te Mata Arawai in terms of the regulators. And it would have to separately report and would still be under the new framework for providing water services strategies, effectively like a long-term plan independent of council's long-term plans. It does mean that the borrowing is underneath council's overall balance of borrowings. So it's whilst it's a new in-house business unit to meet the new regulatory regimes, it looks very similar to the way that it would be now with some other management around it to make sure that it remains ring-fenced. Single council CCO, council-controlled organisation. So this will be a limited liability company, 100% owned by council, with the ownership rights spelled out in the Constitution, subject to further legislation in detail. The council would have the ability to make appointments to representative to then appoint a board for the company that would then appoint a CCO, CE and other staff. So there's a degree of separation there from council and ultimately the water services delivery model.
So maybe if you just, that previous slide, Darren just mentioned something, with the in-house business unit, that's I guess the summary provided by Department of Internal Affairs. There's no restriction or limit to what you might do as a council in terms of governance within that structure. Obviously you'll have the Commerce Commission, you'll have the Te Mata Arawai externally, but internally you are then able to set in place whatever governance, you might want to have an independent, water committee or whatever you might choose to do. You're still then able to do that under the Local Government Act. It doesn't prevent you from doing anything you might consider necessary in that space.
Shelley?
Just a quick question with this, or any of the money that we got for water infrastructure in Otaki, and is there any disadvantage to any of these in the future of getting that kind of funding through central government? Would they favour one or the other, or is that not something considered?
That isn't something we've looked at. I guess that'd be quite hard to get a sense for how that might play out, whether there would be any money available in the first place. But yeah, if you're meeting the regulatory requirements in terms of Commerce Commission and the environmental, I think I would have thought as long as you're complying with those, then I don't see why you'd be treated any differently to any other.
So I've got a question for you, Sean.
Oh, no, sorry.
We were talking with LGFA this morning about the funding for an entity that's available. Is I don't know how far into the model you've got, but is the funding for that, is it contract specific or project specific, or do you just apply for a chunk of money and then use it as and when?
It would be no different to the current process we're in at the moment. I'm assuming Ian probably give you more.
That's right. It's at the entity level, if you like. So if it remained an in-house unit, it would continue to be 280% of council revenue. If it goes into a CCO, it goes to 500% of that entity's revenue. So it's not ring-fenced to particular projects. It's an overall funding line.
Yeah, that's right. And we're in that tier 1, so we like to go up to the 350. I think it was at 330 or 350.
50, yeah.
350.
You go 350 anyway, even if it's in-house.
Yes. Yes.
So, in that single council CCO, very similar arrangements to what a multi looks like in terms of council's ability to influence. Council would issue a statement of expectations, and the water services CCO would respond with a water services strategy to meet those expectations. So it does provide a degree of separation.
How much does it cost to run CCOs, to set them up and run them? And how would that be paid for, through the water revenue or the council revenue?
I think Morrison Lowe in the modelling they've used, they allowed, I think, $8 million to set them up. At the moment, I'm assuming that would be part of the debt. There's either you build that into the debt equation in terms of the entity itself. Otherwise, you're funding it through OPEX, which is a very big number in terms of cost.
You'll see when we've got slides on financials later on, but essentially it adds additional cost to the CCOs, which then flow through ultimately to the cost and pricing. So the CCO, it adds cost that must then be recovered.
And then that cost will be recovered directly from the consumer. So the relationship between council and the water consumer would be separate. So the entity would have that direct relationship in terms of billing. And then the joint council CCO is a very similar model to the standalone, in that there'd be a number of councils together would own the CCO, and they would then have representatives that then, by extension, would appoint the board for the CCO. The same measures apply in terms of whether it's a single or a multi, in terms of how that would function. As an organisation, it would be set with a set of expectations from the councils, and then it would respond through its water services strategy. Effectively, it's long-term planning process. It would have that independence, and would be, the relationship again would be directly with the consumer for water and wastewater services, for billing and debt collection and so forth. So the joint and the single are very similar, other than with a multi or joint, there's a number of councils that own that as a whole.
Just a quick thing on that. So with the joint one, is there a risk that revenue from, say, Kapiti could actually be used to fund infrastructure in other parts? Or the second part of that is more actually, could debt be incurred on using Kapiti as security to fund, say, Wellington and Wellington?
I think that's probably the most fundamental key part of the whole approach to scale and CCO, is that everybody's in the same pot in terms of funding, whether that's operationally, capital. It's all borrowed against the shareholding council, or the entire entity, and then it's allocated across the entire number of service connections that provide for that entity. So, and that is why they're able to, again, as LGFA mentioned, the 350 and the 500%. Again, if your revenue is only $10 million, then you can only borrow up to $50 million. So the more connections, the greater the revenue, the higher that you can borrow, and you can go up to 500%. So it is, and that's basically the rationale behind, and was the same rationale behind Labour's proposal, National's scale, and spreading the costs across a greater number of connections, was a way of balancing that impact.
Great. Carry on. Please.
Yeah, running out of juice on this thing. There you go. So in terms of the joint CCO council options, we've looked at Kapiti Horowhenua as a collective with about 35,000 connections and a population density of about 53. Kapiti Horowhenua, Manawatu and Palmerston North, we've seen those numbers as well, working with Morrison Lowe, and that's over double the number of connections. And then the other one, obviously, is the regional plus Horowhenua District Council, and that brings obviously orders of scale with about 250,000 water services connections and a greater population density, not surprisingly, with the metros in that model. That's just to give you, I like the three different options. You've got the standalone CCO with Kapiti itself, and then these three other options that we've been looking at with Morrison Lowe and through Scott Consulting.
So it's important to realise that this relies on other people's decisions too. For instance, of course, Horowhenua are watching us with interest because they're looking at that option, but if we decide to stand alone, then that changes their options. Likewise, if they decide to go with Palmerston North, that changes what our options are. And we'll note that the one on the right, that whole model is no longer existing as a whole model. We've got the light green one and the grey one, not naming any names, they're out already. So that's actually not what the model looks like at present, is it? Yeah.
Yep.
So just a question. So is there a fourth option, like the in-house option, that you create something in-house as opposed to us creating a standalone CCO, but we create a division within Kapiti, within KCDC specific?
Do you want to go back to that slide? Just to make sure that we've...
Because that's
Option one.
so there's effectively four options,
Okay.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, it might have been before you came in, Nigel, but yes, that's definitely an option. We'll keep flicking through. We can always go back to that after.
Right. That direction.
Yeah, try moving it closer to the presentation.
There we go. Okay. So looking across all those options and across the top there, the first one being a new council internal business unit, so that standalone division within council, Kapiti only CCO, a joint CCO with Horowhenua, and then Horowhenua, Manawatu, Palmerston North, and regional CCO. We've done a high-level assessment, if you like, against those key criteria that we talked about, you know, in terms of what's important to Kapiti, and have given a, if you like, a traffic light system, an initial view, a high-level assessment of the different options in relation to those things that are important. We've got more detail, which Ian will take you through next, on the financials. So we've broken down the financials from being just one line. We've looked at revenue sufficiency, investment sufficiency, and financing, and then of course cost to serve. And the next slide. So if there's appetite for questions on that, Ian will pick that up shortly. So just looking across, effectively from staying an internal business unit to going to a big regional CCO, across that breadth. If you talk about relationships and trusts and ability to influence those localised outcomes, obviously with an internal business unit, council retains direct control of that through the council. And the bigger the entity gets, the further away you get from that decision making effectively, even though with the CCO there's a separation between council and the board of the CCO. If you had a Kapiti only model, it would be focused on delivering Kapiti outcomes. Kapiti Horowhenua provides again a local focus on service, and once you start going to sort of a wider, bigger CCO, the level of focus specifically on Kapiti obviously is diluted through that process until you get out to a regional model where there's some other challenging priorities. Financially, the in-house business unit can balance across the council revenue and debt, so it can use that facility, whereas once you've got a CCO, there will be additional setup costs and additional governance costs to run the CCO, in addition to the additional costs that are going to come from actually meeting the regulatory requirements. There'll be governance costs, and the revenue will be driven by the higher debt ratios, both for the smaller CCOs, if it was standalone or standalone in Horowhenua. Once you get into a bigger model, there are some opportunities for benefit of scale, but looking at the regional one, there's a substantial amount of deferred work and the condition of those assets that's going to drive a lot of the financials in that model. Levels of service, again, smaller local gives greater focus on priority on Kapiti and local priorities. Once you move into a CCO, those are going to be determined by the water services entity itself. But the smaller and more focused it is, the more it focuses on Kapiti and Horowhenua. The wider the model again, the greater it needs to consider all the other influences, and with the regional model, again, some big challenges there in terms of deferred works that need to be addressed, and those will take, you would imagine, priority. Strategy, very similar outcome, localised strategies, small in-house business unit, moving to more wider strategic focus and priority setting the bigger the regional entity becomes. And the counterfactual to that is, in terms of operations, with a smaller in-house business unit, it does leave existing resilience vulnerabilities due to size and scale that you can get with a larger resource pool from a larger organisation. Looking at perhaps more optimal systems and processes in a larger organisation. So that's just the transition as you go across. In terms of scale, you get an increase in that level of flexibility and resource pool, so you're not as reliant on specific individuals to carry a lot of the organisational resilience as the organisation gets bigger. So we've just shown that pretty much in just a traffic light, just to show where orange, where there are some risks within that, and then certainly in the red there are some significant challenges with the regional model for Kapiti.
So the different elements of that would have different weightings though, wouldn't they? For instance, we might decide that resilience is more important than local control, or we might decide that financial considerations are more important than strategic ones. So,
Yeah, that's right. So we haven't.
That's the analysis that
Yeah.
needs to be done.
That's right. So we would, in any options paper, we would set out a lot more, because there's some discussion around efficiencies and scale and procurement capability, and there are other elements within all of these that you might weight slightly different, that you might decide you prefer to look in this direction or that direction. Obviously, we haven't gone into the CCO model. Also, you're totally separated from that water services strategy. So you set that statement of intent, or the entity itself sets the delivery strategy associated with that, and that's signed off by the CCO. Doesn't come back through, and doesn't have any reporting or any function back through council in terms of approval. So yes, there are elements within all of these that we would look to probably expand on and do a bit more work in terms of the future options. This is really just to help you get towards the 28th.
Starting point.
Yeah.
Bernie?
Yeah, thank you. The conditions of the assets you mentioned, and we take Horowhenua, a relatively probably new local authority, and so their pipes should be in reasonable condition. Palmerston North, I think they've got a huge dam, or they did have one time. I remember walking above it. So is that dam, and meets the earthquake regulations now and things like that? In other words, are we going to involve ourselves into huge costs? And that should be dependent on whether whatever we choose. Just stand alone, or go with Horowhenua, or go with Palmerston North.
Have we got some slides about projected
The next one.
Yep.
Next slide.
costs associated with infrastructure?
Yeah, so I guess just each council is looking at developing a water services delivery plan, and as part of that, typically the starting point is your long-term plan for water services, and one of the parts of the work that's been done is examining what other gaps there might be in that and putting that into the modelling, and then Ian can take us through what that modelling is starting to show us at a high level in terms of those ongoing costs. Certainly, as you've seen from Wellington, I think it's around 20% of the pipe network or water networks are in poor to very poor condition, and that drives investment and also drives the level of service. So those sort of considerations have been put into the models.
All right, I've got quite a lot of lights on, so what we're going to do is we're going to box on through the rest of the slides in case some questions are answered as we go. So we'll just do that. Just keep your lights on, and then we'll go through them at the end.
Do you want to pick pick it up from here, Ian.
Thanks.
That way.
Thanks, Martin. Right, so these next few slides just look specifically at the financial dimension of all of this. So in terms of financial sustainability, this material's come from DIA guidance in terms of what the expectations are for this water services delivery plan. And with regard to the financial side, they're looking for investment sufficiency, revenue sufficiency, and financing sufficiency. So just to step through those three things, investment sufficiency is around the level of investment, network investment, a CapEx essentially that's going in that is sufficient to sustain the network and meet the necessary standards that are required. Revenue is about having enough revenue to cover costs, including servicing that debt, and then financing sufficiency is being able to operate within the available funding limits for the entity that you choose to set up. So what we've attempted to do on this slide, similar to the ones Martin's just taken us through, is a little bit of a traffic light rating of those criteria for the various models, the various options that we've got in front of us. So to start with the left-hand side, that is our internal business unit. So to be clear, that is that's the internal division that was mentioned before, just like we have today, except it's going to have the higher obligations around reporting and greater rigour around separation, I think. So it's a more rigorous model, but it remains a division within council. And so from a revenue point of view, we know there will be no immediate need to drive revenue up because it sits within the total council funding situation. So under this option, we have to operate within 280% debt limits. We're currently today around 200%, and the LTP projects that out by year 10 to come down to early hundreds, 110%, something like that, with the debt reduction strategy. So, and if you convert that to dollars, it's in the order of 400 million sort of headroom that you've got under the current LTP projections if you continue with an in-house model. And so whilst I think we're all expecting there will be more CapEx probably required than what's currently in the LTP once these standards become clear and compliance, etc. There's a fair amount of headroom in that model. And if I just go, sorry, you want to?
Oh, no, sorry. We haven't. So a conversation we've had previously is around that stranded overhead conversation, which we haven't really factored into these financial slides. When we talked previously about if you take out the three water services and take them out of the organisation and put them into another entity, there are still those stranded overheads associated with scale that remain. We don't have necessarily a direct relationship back to the finance department, the size of this building, the overheads associated with running HR. There's all of those costs which we've looked at previously are additional costs we'd probably need to factor in at an operational level for the council. So when we looked at them before as part of the labour work, it was about 2.5 million, I think. And that was part of the government's No Worse Off funding, which is not available for here. So just a point to note that we'll factor those back in. They're not, and they're the same for all the CCO options. Basically, it'll be in those in terms of a calculation for the council. In-house business unit obviously doesn't have that cost because we don't have that issue with stranded overheads. So it's just another element that we haven't flagged as part of the table.
That's all right. And so just sort of running down that left-hand option, the IBU. So I've talked about the debt to revenue appears okay. The investment sufficiency would continue to be our LTP enhanced as required. So we would control that. And then down the bottom are the projected prices, and I should probably just to clarify again, all of the modelling that we're talking about here has been done by the consultants that were engaged to support this work. So we had initially Gravel Road who were supporting the regional work, and then we've brought in Morrison Lowe, who have acted for us, plus our neighbours, and then there's a bit of peer review that went on as well between them, and so Morrison Lowe felt Gravel Roads work was reasonable and so on. And sitting in behind that, they've made assessments around the levels of investment that are required and whether the LTPs have enough. With ours, they felt it was broadly right. Horowhenua, for example, they felt that they were unrealistically low in the out years, and so they've actually added further investment in there in order to get for apples and things like the condition assessment. They will have taken that sort of thing into account, I think, to try and quantify what you're really facing. And certainly with Gravel Roads work for Wellington, what drove the big numbers for them is the fact that the asset condition is very poor down there, and therefore there's a lot of investment required. So we've provided the inputs into this, and we've QA'd the results to make sure we broadly understand them, but we're relying on their expertise, I suppose, to produce these figures. And at the bottom there, the last two lines are just showing you the comparative costs 2034, 10 years from now, and then 30 years from now. So that's the IBU option, and then the rest of the table is the various CCO options. So the second column in is a standalone CCO, so that would be us creating a CCO just for our own operations. By moving to that independent entity, we now get caught by the 500% limit and on our water business. And so whilst we've got a lot of debt currently on our water business and relatively low revenues, so today we are running above 500%. When you combine the whole council, the whole thing works. But if you separate it out, then you've got to look at your revenues and debt and basically start to increase your revenue in order to get to that 500% that they're talking about. So there would be a need to start pushing your prices up. As we come to our network, given that that second from the left option is still just Kapiti, so we're still controlling essentially, it's our LTP, our investment plan. I've mentioned the challenge around the debt and then the predicted costs. And the reason that they're a bit higher than the IBU is because of the governance management costs that were touched on before, that you've got. It's a more expensive thing to run, whilst essentially still actually being the same operation. Then as you go to the right across that table, you start to get into your joint options, Horowhenua, and then the next one across is the broader northern grouping, and then on the far right is the Wellington one. So with both, with the Horowhenua and then the Horowhenua Manawatu Palmerston option, looks like there would need to be progressive increases to revenue in order to maintain your ratios, but apparently those combined entities would be able to operate within the 500%. So that it's not a train smash. There's just a need to gradually increase revenues over time. But you'll see in the projected costs, there's there would be a step up, and that would be a bit about the management overlay I've talked about, but then you are starting to get into the broader states of the network, higher costs. I think the Palmerston have got this large wastewater project, etc., and those things add costs that flow through into pricing. Interestingly, in the longer term, when you go to the bottom line there, 2054, the numbers all start to align for those medium-sized groupings at a similar sort of price to what we can project for our standalone, and that's because the view is that scale does give you benefits down the track around purchasing power and better efficiencies for the larger scale organisation, which starts to offset pay back the additional management costs. The far right column is Wellington region, and the reason that's traffic lighted red is that the numbers are pretty stark for them. 4.2 billion or something of catch-up expenditure required just to deal with the deficit that they're facing, and that's in the order of 20 years worth of work. And that just drives all the costs up. And so you'll see the price comparisons in the bottom right, you know, sort of two to 2.5 times probably what we're looking at for our own operation. And it starts to settle down again in the longer run, 20 to 30 years out, but still, you know, 1.5, 2 times the level that we would expect for our smaller groupings.
Is it worth just, I know, because when we had the presentation from the regional project group, there is work they're still doing to look at what does that mean in terms of charging and when that charging might change and what it looks like. And that's a piece of work that we don't know what the results of that are, but they've been quite key to make sure that there's an understanding that the things might not move as quickly to that number in the short term, and there'll be some balancing, I assume, or some way of trying to minimise the impact of shifting to those higher costs. But we don't know what that is, but that's certainly was part of the report and part of, you'll see it on the 28th. There's some work yet to be done to reflect that, but ultimately these are the costs that have to be recovered at some point through that life cycle.
And this really just graphically represents, you know, those last couple of rows. The top one is just showing what that looks like 2034, and it just, as I've just said, you know, Wellington on the right, you've basically double. Our in-house operation appears to be the lowest cost on the left, and then the various northern groupings are slightly higher, but then when you push it out to 2054, 30 years from now, you know, there's really no difference projected for those northern groupings, but Wellington remains a higher cost option. And then this is actually the same information, but presented in a slightly different way. It's predicting what the shape of the price curve looks like going forward. So we're the grey line and pretty much flat-lined at just under $2,000. The black line is the grouping including Palmerston North and Manawatu, and so that rises up quite a bit in the 10-year sort of time frame, and that's all to do with that one project, I believe, or largely to do with that project, which is in the order of 750 million apparently. And so they have to sort of deal with that, digest that. Once they've got that under their belts, then everything sort of stabilises down towards a similar price to ours. And then the two smaller groupings with Horowhenua, or what is it, our CCO and then Horowhenua CCO, do start higher, and I think that's to do with that needing to achieve the debt revenue. But again, gradually over time, they're predicted to come down towards similar sort of pricing 30 years from now. So that, in a nutshell, is sort of the financial perspective.
Okay, we'll take questions up to there then. Glenn?
Yeah, great. On looking at slide 15, just comparing the IBU to the standalone CCO on the debt ceiling, the 500%. That I got two questions related to the debt ceiling. The increase in revenue needed to hit the 500% debt, is that just to hit the ceiling, or does that leave some leeway? So is that going to bring actually to 400% to mean that there will be money left to increase debt if needed, or are you going to, is that just to hit the 500%, which leaves nothing in the pot for, you know, unplanned or other capex as it's needed?
The figures we've provided, all of the modelling's based on the figures that we've provided through to DIA 2-3 years ago, or a couple of years ago, that's been rolled forward. And in particular, I think I've made the point a few times, we allocated all of our unfunded depreciation, which is about $60 million. We allocated all of that to water, and so that's one of the reasons why the water debt is so high, and we did that because it was in council's interests to try and recover as much debt as possible. So we've got a relatively high amount of debt there, and on the flip side, I think our revenue's been we've always been keen to keep our water charging, as low as possible. So the ratio of those two things today is about 550% or something like that. And so, yeah, we would you can bring your ratios down as far as, as quickly and as far as you like. It's a question of how much you're prepared to push your price up. That's basically what it boils down to. So, if we increased our current charges by 10% per annum for 3 or 4 years, and I think we could have a look at the total debt, and just because that would be another decision I think that we would be able to make. Is it right that we put all the unfunded depreciation there? Perhaps we bring the debt levels down by 20 or 30 million. You'd find, I think you'd come under the 500, but you wouldn't be at 200. That's for sure. It's going to be up there. And so if your investment had to keep growing, you'd just need to keep pricing accordingly.
Okay, good. The second one related is a standalone CCO that would have its own debt rating. I take it would get its own debt rating from Moody and whoever.
We had LGFA here this morning actually, and so they talked about it would need to be guaranteed by the council. And
so even a standalone CCO.
In order to access. It could be independent, but would require its own credit rating.
Yeah.
But that really is a large scale thing, i.e. Watercare. For us and for most other councils, council would need to guarantee that CCO.
Okay. Yeah, but I guess where I was coming with that is, if a CCO has a debt of 500%, their rating is likely to be a lot worse than an organisation at 200%. Well, it's not necessary, but possibly and probably likely, because a lot of these ratings are based on debt to assets and can they pay.
Hang on, Liz, we're going to get a response from staff.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's as I say, I don't think you were here for the LGFA meeting, but they providing council guarantees, then they won't need to get their own.
Then they won't need to. I mean, yeah.
And sorry, what LGFA was saying is that those sorts of ratios are quite usual internationally for this type of entity. So it's it's viewed as appropriate, I suppose, or not inappropriate for entities of that nature internationally to have that sort of level of debt.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
But one of the things that the DIA looked at, the previous work, when they were standalone CCOs, they looked at a triple B. There was some conversations with I'm not sure it was LGFA, but they did talk about those credit ratings, and triple B was the number they were looking at in terms of what they were applying. Now that may have been in advance of LGFA saying they would lend, but LGFA will only lend if you're still linked to the council.
Yeah.
So there's a balance, and some of the legislation coming through might make that clearer, but there was definitely a separation between council underwriting balance sheet linked to credit rating staying similar, standalone completely, non-linked to council, non-LGFA or triple B type ratings for those entities early on in that process.
But in those days, though, the entities they were talking about were much larger. You were talking about 4 entities nationally, and so that makes a difference, and you need scale, I think, for this sort of thing to have your own credit rating.
Great. Bede?
Thank you. If I was a decision maker, which I'm not on this, obviously, but if I was, one of the things that would be speaking to me is what we've currently got is a group that has proven over a sustained period that they can do an excellent job of this stuff. Whereas all of those other options are completely mysterious. We don't know who's going to do them or what sort of quality of job they're going to do. Is that are we kind of factoring that into the mix here?
Not explicitly.
And I'm sorry to give you a compliment there, Sean, but there was no
That's
option.
all right.
It's all right, Ben. You're actually allowed to give Sean.
Am I? I didn't see that in the job description.
Well, we haven't projected out how long that might,
What?
you know, the longevity of staff, but it's yeah, somewhere, not at this desk, but it is. I think it's part of that water services strategy. Yeah, no, we haven't done that. Again, that is part of that conversation, I guess, was we talked about it slightly at the last one. You know, if you look to some of these entities that are already established in scale and their track record in terms of delivery, but no, it's very
still an
difficult to
unknown,
say that.
isn't it? Yeah.
It is, that's exactly what
Yeah.
it, but, you know, Watercare, I don't know whether, you know, that's a large entity, totally separate, you know, in terms of their ability to deliver. So then there are these international models that you can look to in terms of what they deliver and how they deliver it at that sort of scale, I guess. But no, we haven't applied that sort of subjective view to it. It's really financial, and then a lot of elements associated with risk around the legislation and the order, you know, requirements in that space, rather than level of comfort with any particular model. I mean, that's probably a decision for council.
Okay.
In your,
Just thought I'd raise it. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. Nigel?
You may not be a decision maker, but you're like a TikTok influencer, Bede. To Bede's point, one of the apart from the obvious philosophical truism that the far right option is never the best choice, but the existing knowledge. I'm not saying these other entities, particularly a regional entity, doesn't. They have an enormous amount of knowledge and skills, etc. What we have here is specific knowledge about the Kapiti system, which they may not have. So anyway, take the compliment you got earlier. The other question that I have about the far right option here is that I'm presuming that that's predicated on it being complete. So we're kind of Ginger Rogers at the dance party, I would have thought. People are old enough to get that reference. But if you take us out of that and you have a look at the graph doesn't get any better for the far right option. It gets worse because we're in a better position, presumably. So that number, and it's not just us, but if any of the other entities, any of the other councils that may decide to not be part of that, then those numbers skew. So the more it's Wellington City, the worse it gets. Do you know what I mean? So that's something else that we would have to think about. We would need to know who else is coming to the party if we were going to go down that track. So I think that's.
Sorry, so can we just get some clarification around that one, and then you go on to your next one? Is that okay?
Yep.
Sure.
So I think the margins we're talking about in terms of connections and cost and investment from those small, for us, for example, are not significant enough to make a substantive difference in terms of the numbers they're talking about for the regional option. But yes, it is slightly different. But I'm not sure whether they might pick it up if you. The scale, you know, Wellington's revenue is 300 million or 280. Yeah. So yes, it does get worse, but I don't think it's substantive enough to start to undermine the viability of what they're
Or
suggesting.
otherwise.
Yeah,
Okay.
but you will.
Okay, next,
And
next one.
another question is the price, the average cost to customer 2034 is that 1890. Presumably that's on a graduated scale. So what is it? What's the number today? Like as we stand.
The graph, the scatter plot with the line on it.
Yeah, so it looks like it's about 1800,
Scatter
something like along those numbers. Is that 9? Yeah. Okay.
1600.
Right. And so when we're looking at the because I didn't quite understand this. So cost to customer, so in 2034, we're saying it's going to be 1890 that year, right? So in 2033, it's going to be a bit less than that. So presumably that's the scale, right? Yeah.
So that grey line reflects the rate of rise associated with that charge.
Right.
Look, the cost.
Yeah, they're
Not the
uninflated.
charge.
They're uninflated numbers too. So that,
Yeah.
so in reality, you would have an inflation factor on these. But what
Yeah.
they're saying is, in real terms,
Yeah.
essentially the charge would remain consistent.
So I can only imagine what the public reaction would be if you told them that you're going to be paying $5,000 for your water in 2034, just for your water. That would burn this building down and us in it. So
Where's that?
the final thing is, has there been, in terms of an internal business unit, and we know that there will be some costs associated with that, but has there been any work done on what that would be? Would that require extra personnel? Yeah, because there'll be some extra costs presumably.
Yeah, so we haven't broken it down to that level, but yes, as we've mentioned, Martin, there is going to be more work associated with the changes to legislation.
Yeah.
So more reporting, more scrutiny in terms of what you're doing around condition of your assets and things like that. So yes, so at the moment we haven't factored in a large increase in terms of cost, but it applies with all of those options. Whether it's an internal business unit or those costs have gone up, and Morrison Lowe added some money in there. But I'm not sure.
I think they have. I think they've made an assumption, and they talked about, was it sort of up to 10 FTE kind of level that would be required to meet the new standards, even with an internal business unit. And I think that's probably why our grey line does rise in that first year or two.
Yeah, and so given that it's OPEX, in terms of funding, it's likely to come to rates, and I'm just wondering, given that that's in the next part of our LTP in that timeline, so I just don't need an answer now, but obviously that's going to impact on that 7% number that we've set for those years. Does it get sufficiently high to impact that?
Haven't modelled it.
We would have to go and check. The water charges were going up because we had that conversation about we had a bit of a gap there in terms of funding. So there was an increase there already factored in. We'd have to have a look at what that might look like. We haven't done that work directly. That would be implementation, looking at whatever model starting from the first year of the next LTP.
Yeah.
So that would be the further work we'd need to do in terms of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there would have to be an impact.
Yes, will be.
But as you say, it won't be the coming year. It'll be whenever we choose to implement.
Yeah. Thank you. That's great.
Martin.
Thank you. And I suppose it would be fair to say that there'll be a diminishing cost to rates in reflection to that, because you'll be taking that out of your rates bill and putting it into your water bill. I mean, it's just robbing Peter to pay Paul, but but
Yeah, well, because the other element to this, I guess, is what's left behind in terms of the council's position, which is a little bit around that overhead conversation as well, but ability to borrow, how you reflect that charging. At the moment, we would, if it was an internal business unit, it would still, in theory, be in those numbers, but it will be a charge on your water, wastewater bill.
It's fundamentally just an adjustment of where that charge is going to be, per se. Whereas if it was taken in part of the other units, that would actually be completely gone, and our rates bill, if you like, would be adjusted to reflect that. Whatever that might look like. Yeah. But that would be the long term. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, 3 questions I had. That wasn't one of them. So with this, we're in a little bit of a unique situation, aren't we? Because of the situation we're in with our water, how we're not really connected to the others as such, which means us looking at this option, IBU, very, very appealing. But it's because we're in the situation we're in, and where we're geographically located as well, and the connections we have. So we were able to do that, I guess is what I'm saying, on our own. That was just clear. So just putting it to that, because lots of other councils won't be in that situation, will they?
That's right. Yes. Well, Horowhenua are totally separate in terms of all of their assets.
Yeah.
Masterton, the Wairarapis,
Okay.
they're not connected to the bulk supply, I don't think, in terms of Greater Wellington. So yeah, the 4 metros are all
Okay.
have overlapping infrastructure that provides water across boundaries.
Okay, that's cool. Second one, what's the main driver? I mean, if you look at average price cost 2034 at the IBU versus the WSCCO, there's obviously a cost in between that, yet the only difference really is that it's sort of completely ring-fenced, whereas one's internal. So what's the main driver for that price difference? Is that an initial, you're talking an $8 million initial setup, which will be part of that, I'm picking, but that seems like quite a big difference.
Yeah, and it will be those sorts of things, the additional, the setup costs, and then the additional ongoing, you know, you've got a board, you've got a dedicated management team, that's all cost. And to be honest, the CCOs really, they're all about scale, and so setting up a CCO just for your own Kapiti operation probably isn't there's probably not a lot of point to it. Because really, it's as I say, fundamentally it's the same thing, just with more costs. So if you were going to go into CCOs, I think that's where you'd be looking at the amalgamations.
Yep,
To,
gotcha.
you know, to the right.
Okay, good to get that clear. You talked about stranded overheads and all that sort of scenario. So if we're in the CCO scenario, would we potentially or be in the position where we could, within the organisation, contract services out to the CCO per se? Or, no, actually I don't think we would be, because the CCO would be actually taking all the services, wouldn't it? And it would be, if it was a standalone, you could potentially do that. No? I'm just saying, like payroll, say for argument's sake, to minimise that cost, potentially it's already set up within the council structure. Council could contract
Back to the CCO.
Yeah.
back to the CCO.
So-
You couldn't do it if it was a joint one, but potentially you could do it if it was a standalone one.
You would want to go through all those sorts of services. You would want to create as little duplication as possible.
Of course. And that's where we'll be able to maximise things in the IBU. As in, it would just be like, and we wouldn't have to seriously break all that apart. It would just be sort of like an allocation, a bit like we do now with regards to, an overhead allocation would just be going out, but we wouldn't be needing to break anything apart per se.
No, I mean it's a separate division, if you like, now.
It will be a separate division,
But what I'm imagining is just greater rigour and scrutiny around, exactly what you're costing, exactly what your overheads are that you're charging, those sorts of things.
But those would be accounting. That's a financial.
There'd be financial separation with regards
but
to...
there's no physical. You wouldn't need to. No, so it would be setting up some barriers around that financially. So it'd be all in Ian's space, sort of behind the scenes, and the computer will sort it out.
Yep. No, that's all cool. I just wanted to check on that. That's me. Thanks.
David.
Oh, thank you. I'd just like to raise a couple of sort of risk issues from my perspective, and just for councillors to think about. And it's a really good presentation, thanks. But back at one of the earlier ones, it talked about resilience and how resilience was higher in a bigger organisation. And that's probably true for water, but as Martin and you've just discussed, our water system is entirely separate. So Wellington's might collapse under its own weight. Any other part of the system is going to collapse because of earthquake or something like that. And if you're in the big organisation, you might want to think about how many of your brains and your movable assets have already gone over the Wainui Saddle to the big town down south and aren't going to come back if there's pressure on everybody for resources. So resilience might actually be better if you're on your own, with your own trucks, with your own engineers who, as someone said, know where the pipes are, or we hope they do, and know how to fix them. So resilience might actually be the reverse of that if you're looking at it wider than just the water system stops. So maybe think about that. The other thing that, and I think just from last week, someone said that one of the presenters said it costs $4 million a year to run a KCDC CCO. I don't know if that's still being verified or not. The other thing is the council as a customer. And when I asked last time, at the last meeting, it was said that the council swimming pools use about $240,000 worth of water a year. Now, council, my guess is that council is probably its own biggest customer. I don't know, the time you add in sports fields and your buildings and everything else, I don't know if anyone else would use more water in the area than we do ourselves. And you can charge whatever you like to yourself because it's going around in a circle. But if you go into something bigger, you're going to be paying those bills to whatever that entity is. Even if it's your own CCO, it's going to be billing you. You might have a nice fight about how much, whether the water rate should be domestic or commercial, or what it should be for the pools or the football fields or whatever. But I think that's something to factor in. Just how much does the council itself spend on water? And if the charges go up in any of those entities, does that mean the council's exporting money to the various entities? I haven't heard any mention yet on just what that is. I mean, and you might want to get someone to do some numbers for you.
Yes, so we do. We know so that $280,000 is across the whole. That's the cost of water across the entire organisation.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So we have a lot of amazing. We've got a lot of bores out there in terms of our sports fields. So we're quite well placed in terms of resilience for potable non-use of potable water in that space. And then it's really, the domestic, this building and some other buildings we've got. So it's not a huge number. And the wastewater treatment plants, obviously, they recirculate and reuse water where they can. So it is part of that number, but it's not a huge number. And it used to be the way we ran the system. We didn't charge ourselves, but when we put more metering in, we had quite a bit of a catch up to do to reflect that cost back.
Good.
So
yeah, thanks. Well, that's fine. The other thing is looking at 2054. I mean, I won't be around unless you put something really juicy in the water. But it was the last local government reform was 35 years ago, and I don't think they're going to wait another 30 for the next one. So there is a lot of water, Liz, yeah. But you might want to think about strategically how you're placed if you want to maintain any independence in Kapiti. And Kapiti's done pretty well of trying to be independent to date. The more you're hooked in with other authorities, the more easy it's going to be for government to push you into bigger entities. That might be good, might be bad, but are you closing off options? Depending on which way you go. I mean, transport is already, no one really argues that transport shouldn't be regionally run. Looks like a regional council run, not a regional council run, but a regionally run entity, the big ones. It's going to be hard to say, well, we're in with you for water, we're in with you for transport, but we want to be alone. We're starting to look like a community board or something already. If you so they're just things I think you might like to think about. The final point, and we'll talk about the referendum and ways around it, and talk about changing standing orders. That requires, as I understand it, 75% vote, which means any 3 councillors can stop it. 75% of 11 is, 9. So any 3 say no, you don't get your 75%. So someone might have to do a lot of persuading if you want to get people to start doing that. Thank you. That's all I want to say.
Very helpful. Thanks, David. Shelley.
I'm just wondering, because we've got to make a decision not to go with Wellington, whatever, or to explore other ideas. But the water service delivery plan, so we are predicting, or they're telling us what they might have in their plans, but they don't actually have to work it up until the end of next year. So we could get quite surprised by them adding stuff. Like if they go, we forgot to tell you about this big project. Like it's like the chicken before the egg or whatever. We're not going to, they don't have to have full disclosure before we decide to go with them.
That's true, although there has been a lot of work done at that officers working group level to make sure that isn't the case. So the last 4 months we've been working with that, the regional group, meeting regularly and going through, and we also went through a similar exercise with Morrison Lowe to look at the next 10 years worth of investment and just to make sure there wasn't anything that wasn't on there that we knew about. So it would be a bit of a shock. I think the rest of the regional council, they would be a bit upset if someone trumped a $300 million sludge plant or something in there. But Yeah. So yes, so it is a low risk, and I don't expect, in terms of the modelling and where everyone's at, you've still got in 3 years' time the ability to modify. I mean, that's probably more of an issue as we move through the next 10 years. Things you don't know about necessarily come online.
Liz?
Yeah, look, it seems to me that everything's pointing towards the IBU. So just, yeah, I mean, you must have a gut feeling for where this is going to land by now, having done all this work. So I'm thinking it's probably the IBU. I just want to, pick up, I guess, on a point that David made. We've got 30 years in front of us here. Anything can happen in that time. And my view is we need to take a short-term approach with this, a holding pattern, and not close off any options. And look at what the implications might be should the political environment shift, or should, who knows what happen in the next 30 years. And so I think a conservative approach is to stick with the IBU, and then to look at, if there's any reason why we would shift from there. I mean, we have all those options available in front of us down the track, whereas if you, perhaps pick another path, it might be hard to reverse it and go down a different path. So, once you joined up with, say if you took option 4, for example, and you suddenly realised down the track that wasn't necessarily the best approach, it would be really difficult probably to back out of that kind of an arrangement. So I think that, short, medium, long-term approach, that dimension should be part of the what we consider in terms of making this decision. Are we leaving our options as fully open as possible? Because who knows what the political environment will be in 10 years' time, let alone 30 years' time. So while you might see longer-term savings, with those other models, there's no guarantee of that because there's so much uncertainty around that length of time. That's all I want to say. But I mean, am I right in saying, is your gut feeling telling you that the IBU is the way to go at this point? Is that the one to beat? Is that the option to beat? Or you're not willing to say that?
Maybe that's part of the reference to some of the issues sitting behind some of these that the Mayor mentioned around what's important to the council in terms of making that decision. We haven't talked a lot about what does that look like if you move to a CCO. Obviously, you transfer some debt. What does that look like for the council that's left behind? And I think that's one of the key questions. Maybe is what's driving that decision, and for some councils, their level of debt and what they're able to do without taking out the debt associated with the Three Waters is a question, is a big issue because of the scale of what they're looking at, and then how are they able to fund that moving forward because of the scale of what's in the Three Waters as well. So if you just looked at the numbers as they stand at the moment, there's not a lot suggesting there's a huge benefit in going outside of the IBU at the moment. But again, it's been mentioned a couple of times, what might happen in 5, 10, 30, 50, those are, and Kapiti is well placed because we are relatively young in terms of infrastructure, but again, it's the 10, 15, 20, and what does that look like? So that's probably some more work we might need to do around the options to bring back to you in terms of consideration. What does the council look like if you take out the Three Waters for a CCO? Yes, you have those overheads that you still have to find, but you, in theory, drop back down to $150 million worth of debt as an entity. I'm not sure what the number would be, but and we're also, as a council, not struggling in those ratios between debt to revenue at the moment. And even if you project out the long-term plan, we're not in the same space as other councils who are struggling there. I don't think so. I mean, professionally, there is resourcing, resilience was mentioned. It is difficult still to find a small organisation. We've got staff that are on call 1 week out of 3, 1 week out of 2. You know, if you've got a slightly bigger, larger organisation, you might be able to go to 1 week in 4. Or if we have a treatment plant operator, we've got a number of those. If they're not available, if they're sick or they're away, if you've got 20 as opposed to 10, even though you're sharing those across a wider catchment, you've still got a little bit more resilience. But I'm not sure if those are significant enough to say, absolutely, there you go, there's the win for Kapiti in terms of a alternative model. But we need to bring that back for you to have a look at in terms of the options report.
Yeah, and if I can just comment, I suppose, when I look at that, I suppose it is suggesting the IBU is a good option, but I'll probably just clarify that it's certainly a viable option. No, there doesn't seem to be any doubt around that. And I suppose my opinion is you go across them, you know, setting up a CCO, as I said before, just for our operations, I can't really see the point in that because that's just cost. The far right option doesn't look very good because the numbers are pretty challenging. But I do think in some of those northern groupings, you know, possibly there is, you know, there's some options there that we should be thinking about.
And we need to have options. We're required to, of course, as you know. Rob?
Oh, thanks. Hey, thanks for this report. It's a hell of a complex, and I think you've got it down to a pretty straightforward decision-making situation. Hey, just going back to your page 18 with the graphs there, I take it the grey one is the IBU, the Kapiti IBU? Oh, 7, is it the next one, 17? Is it? The one with the graphs. That's it. The grey is the IBU, yes. Kapiti IBU, and we take it that based on 24-25, the beginning of the IBU line there, would a status quo of Kapiti maintain a horizontal line at 1500 if we didn't do anything?
No.
Okay. It would go up a wee bit, would it?
We don't have an option to do.
I know. I appreciate that. No, just hypothetically.
Oh no, it would still go up. There's a cost element associated with that, associated with the changes, but there's also increased costs.
Okay.
Just through doing what we do at the moment in terms of extra.
Thanks, Sean. Just going back to that, with the increased cost of the IBU alone, you talked about the compliance costs going into CapEx. How much of that would be extra infrastructural requirements due to regulation, and how much would be regulatory, just extra compliance and that?
We did allow, I think there was an allowance for environmental CapEx put into the numbers. That certainly the regional model had 10 million. So that there are numbers factored in terms of all of those. They had growth related, then they had environmental, and then they've got renewals. So, you know, the 3 elements.
So some of the compliance would require extra pipes and things like that to comply, or
probably more around treatment plants.
Treatments, yeah, okay.
Yeah, and those numbers are factored into those projections. An estimate. It's very hard to quantify what that is. Certainly, even in 10 years, it's hard to. But yeah, 30 years again is quite.
Yeah, those
complex.
That financial modelling is extremely challenging, isn't it?
There's still a bit of uncertainty around the regulatory framework. We've got Bill 3 and it talks about Bill 2 meet all statutory obligations, which will be fleshed out in Bill 3. So we still don't know what those look like. It's kind of a mystery box of statutory obligations that need to come out in Bill 3, and that comes out in December. So there's a question mark around that. And there's also Te Matu Arawai setting the standards for wastewater discharges. So currently that's happening at a regional council level, being the environmental regulator. And Te Matu Arawai is taking that up, and they'll have, and this is to give more cost certainty to local authorities or to water service deliverers, because of the variance of getting a wastewater discharge consent across the country. That's going to be standardised up in a number of different suites of discharge consent requirements. So hopefully that helps it a bit, but there's still a number of uncertainties in terms of those statutory obligations and the cost of those in the future.
Can we have Rob back, please, Evan?
There was a comment before about all of this came about because Three Waters that was repealed. and a lot of councils did a lot of work in order to get that, they brought it ahead of schedule in order to get that funding, and now they're in a situation where they have to find the funding. So just pushing that along the line a bit when the central government come up for re-election, can all of this be repealed and the whole lot thrown out and kicked around like a political football again? Sorry, silly. It's a patsy question, yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Cam.
Kia ora. Absolutely taking on board what Liz is saying with just, the fact that political stuff can change quite quickly in, next election or something of the sort. IBU has all these lovely green lights all over it, though the average cost to the customer in 2054, and I realise this is long-term modelling, is the highest of everything except for the far right. Is that, and looking at that line graph earlier, is that trend going to continue, do you think? Like the IBU cost will stay higher than all of the CCO options? Like, I know that's looking out 30 years, but if we're then committing to something which in 40 years or 50 years may be costing a lot more.
It's not
Because that's the only disadvantage that I can see from the IBU is the long-term cost appears to be more.
That one.
So is the CCO with Horowhenua and the others, do they continue on that lower track in terms of costs?
So are you looking at the financial overview benefits and disbenefits, or the high-level assessment of options? It's important that we look at the high level of assessment of options, because there are more than financial considerations to this.
So that was just a related question. Like, I understand, and there's lots of green lights for the IBU on the high level assessment as well. But it was just a quick question: is if we're committing our ratepayers to something in the longer term, is it going to be a more expensive option? Like, will it continue to be?
Well, what Morrison, they are projecting there in Gravel Road, are saying that in the longer run, the larger entities can access efficiency gains that aren't available to a standalone or just a Kapiti only option. And so that's what they're projecting, is that over time, and when you follow the shape of that black line, for example, there's a medium-term rise while arrears are dealt with, but in the longer run, their view is there are efficiency gains they can get through better procurement and that sort of stuff that wouldn't be available to us, that bring the whole thing down again.
But it's relatively, if you look at the percentage difference, and if you put if you overlaid on there certainty, risk, where your understanding of that was sitting, your certainty and elements of the first 10 years at least, you've got a lot more certainty, even though there is some uncertainty in there in terms of risk around those numbers. Once you get out after, even 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, a 3%, 2% difference, it's within the margins.
I get that it's modelling. It was just something that was intriguing me. I mean,
yes, I asked a similar question to Dougal when he was here and asked for more evidence around the long-term benefits of scale, and I haven't got as much information as I want about that personally yet. Seeing as Nigel's already asked quite a few questions, I'm going to go to, and we're kind of running out of time. I'll get back to you, Nigel, but I'll go to Jocelyn because she hasn't asked Denny yet.
Thank you, Janet. So I'm just looking at page 18. About the decision that we've got to be making on the 28th, which is actually about whether or not we're in or out of this regional plan. I note, it's great to see what the other options are, but I think I just want to double check that is the only, well, not the only, but that is the decision we've got to make on the 28th. And then after that, we will then focus on the other delivery models.
Yes, that's it. And that is really just, as I mentioned, the certainty that's needed for the regional project to start spending more money basically on that option. So
Yep.
that's
Okay.
the only decision that is we're required to make on that date.
Okay, so then so page 17, the one with the graph, the regional council options cost to customer over time is not included?
No, Wellington's not on that graph.
It's off the top of it.
I can imagine it would be, but just to reiterate,
The
the costs.
5,000.
Yeah, I suppose it's just how you draw your graph, but, yeah. Okay, so, yes, so, yes, that's really, I just really wanted to highlight those points, the decision that we're going to be making on the 28th, and that further down the line, we will dig into more of these other options in terms of which way we go. And I suppose, to me, it's not only about the cost to customers, it's actually about, you know, what the risks are, which have been mentioned around the table, and other, I suppose, implications that we need to make as well. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's the only decision that we have to make. I just had a little aside with Darren about potentially knocking off the individual CCO as well at that point, because I just heard Ian say he could, I think the words were couldn't see the point, because it's essentially the same services but with extra costs. So we could let go of that one at the same time, potentially.
And the trust.
And the trust, all those ones which aren't going to be kind of possible, and then we're left with some options that we really see as viable to keep working on, so that we start to streamline what we're doing. But we'll have another conversation about what those recommendations look like, and we'll get back to you. Nigel?
Yeah, so have to by the 28th. Where did the have to come from? Why do we have to make a decision on that date?
Well, we need to decide if we want to put in more funding to the regional option, and if we don't decide to put the funding in by that date, then they'll proceed without us.
Right, I totally understand that, but I think they're making a big mistake. We would be making the same mistake. There's a Bill 3 is coming up in December. Now, we don't know what impact that might have on this whole thing. Parliament's an interesting place. I don't know, maybe you guys are more familiar with the bill than I am, but if there's something that happens in there that would manifestly impact the decision that we make, how clever is it to make a decision while legislation's still live? Now, I think it's, for me, something massively dramatic would have to happen to have the regional option come back into play, but maybe something massive does happen. I mean, it's live legislation. I just wonder why, and even from a regional point of view, that sounds like they're kind of pushing things along prematurely. I would want to know what is the legislation that we are having to deal with.
Okay, Darren's going to take that because he's been at the regional meetings.
Thank you. Thanks, Nigel. It's really about timing, and we always knew that we would be making decisions without having all of the information. But it comes down to the need to have the water services delivery plan ready for that 25 date, and the commitment. So we've been able to cover, right, what we needed to from within our current budgets. The next step though is millions.
Yeah.
Right, to go to that next step, and so we need to know as a region who is in, so that you can commit financially and then commit the time and effort to start to work up what will be that regional water services delivery plan. So yes, we acknowledge that we won't have all of the information when we make that date, but as a collective, that was the advice that we provided to the governance group, which is mainly made up of mayors. There's a couple there that haven't put their mayors in, and of course regional council. So yeah, that was the agreement that we based that decision on.
I mean, personally, I've got enough information to make a decision now, but and it could have a couple of months ago. But when we are given a paper on the 28th, I'm assuming that the paper isn't just going to say option A, be part of this, option B, not be part of this, right? So you've kind of got to present at least some other options. But so I'm just wondering, are we not going to have this conversation again? Or are we going to be narrowed down in terms of the options that will be presented? Because otherwise we could just go around the houses again. I'm just wondering what shape that might take.
So yeah, the Local Government Act provisions still remain in terms of you have to consider all those options. So even though we've talked about the individual CCO and the trust, what's likely is we'll provide all of those, but our recommendations will look something like, well, these ones we suggest you proceed with. These ones we've considered and discounted, but they'll be in the paper. So you'll have 7 or whatever the number is options, and then depending on certainty over the amount of information that we have, we would, and that might be again something for today to talk about that in terms of further work. These 3 need us to go away and do some more and come back to you before you make a decision on those. That's generally what the other papers have looked like for the rest of the region. And again, there's a couple of councillors have said no, they're not going down the southern track, but we are now starting to get into quite a tight time frame. So last meeting I think is the 11th or 12th of December. We're then not back till end of January. If we need to go through a referendum as well as the consultation, then things start to, I think at the last briefing we talked about, we'd struggle probably to meet the timeline. We'd have to really push. It's on the last slide. Yeah, so at the moment we understand there's a bit of work we need to do, maybe on some of the risks and some of the benefits around those options that are not clear in the traffic light structure. But we're not aware of a huge amount of remodelling, and we believe we've done enough work to present quite a balanced paper with options for you to consider, and maybe won't need a lot more work maybe to look at some of the options over the Christmas, January period, and then come back, because we really will be starting to get quite close in terms of the timeline. And the other element to this is the consultation. If we're going with an annual plan process in March, if we're able to, or if we have a conversation about do we include options as part of that consultation, because then if we don't, then again, if you're in April, May, you're starting to get closer to June, July, then you're into election. So it all starts to get very tight. So one of the key things we need to do, I think, is to bring a timeline to show you something in terms of that timing and how it all might fit together. Yeah, so we can do that as part of the paper. Is there anything else today that you think we need to be looking at in terms of what we bring to you on the 28th?
Does anybody have any answer to that question before I continue on through the lights? So I'm going to Jocelyn.
You mentioned about a weighting of some of the various considerations. I think that would be quite important, quite useful. So you've got, obviously, well, it's...
I think that's more for us to decide how important we think things are, but just my message was more to just kind of bear that in mind as we look at the different...
Okay. I think at some point that will be useful further down the line. I think
how we do it.
That would be useful. Maybe not for the 28th, but something to consider. So obviously you've got the information on the 15th, on the page on the 15th, and then on the 13th, on the 13th page.
Martin?
Yeah, mine's not in regards to what you're just talking to, but after saying that, I've been comfortable with the trajectory of the information we've been receiving. It's getting more refined, it's getting easily to understand, and I'm picking that by the time we get to that meeting, will be quite a nice sort of finish-off space after these ones here. So nothing I wanted to add to it. I had two curiosity things I wanted to just sort out though in my own head. One of them is just in relation to what David was talking about with regards to supply of water. When we, just bear with me here for a second, when we put water meters in, one of the issues that was discovered was leakage with regards to water not making it through the system, in other words, council pipes or anything along that sort of line. And it was, correct me if I'm wrong, it was fairly significant, but it's been able to be addressed, or I'm picking it's been addressed to a point as such. But at the end of the day, it costs to create the water in that leakage. That would be a fair call, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Yep, 100%.
So we heard from Wellington that they're losing 60%. So they're producing, out of their 100% of producing water, the cost of that, 60% of it's lost pretty much, well, and it's non-recoverable because they don't have water meters. That's right, isn't it? So we do have water meters and we've sorted that one out, but that cost, if we're involved, should we say, in those entities, is a cost fundamentally that those entities will wear because they won't be able to bill it to anyone.
Will they just divide the total cost across all their customers so you don't get a...
So we would then get caught with regards to paying for that leakage, the production of the water for that leakage, even though we've sorted our one out. You know, fundamentally, that leakage aspect will have a substantial, I would have thought, would have had another substantial cost to it.
Yep, it's a so there's a little piece in there about cross subsidisation.
Yeah, yeah.
So and this only recently came up at the governance conversations. I think there's a holding price.
Yeah.
Let's just say for the first 5 years. So for argument's sake, if we are at $1,500 as an example, that's the cost of ours. That's what it stays for us. It's because that was a quite a sticking point, was cross subsidisation.
Yeah.
Just
wasn't a cross subsidisation I was initially
what
thinking
you're talking
of, but,
about. So
I just thought about that then.
yeah, so there's a hold price while we get ourselves sorted, and then we start to see the rationalisation and some equalisation.
Which sort of really leans towards that argument of what Liz was talking about, waiting 5 or 10 years while the others get all metered and all that sort of scenario, so that we've got a little bit of a better or even playing field in that particular part of the distribution of cost.
Yeah, you would have to understand how a single entity would bill customers when some of the customers are on meters and some aren't.
Yeah.
But the overall cost to provide the service is, in theory, spread across all their customers.
Yeah.
So if one set of customers is able to quantify their usage volumetrically, and then 80% of them are not,
because then there'll be the
you have a
aspect
very
of
large fixed charge.
Yep.
And a very small volumetric charge, but it would get
because at the moment,
bit
council,
strange.
we as a council would wear that cost with regards to if we've got leakage. But if there's a billing back, if these are separate entities, there'll be a certain amount of billing back option if you can measure. But if you can't measure, that makes it very, very hard. So it's got to be aggregated, you know, or averaged out. Okay, that's cool.
I think you raise a really good point, and I wonder if it should maybe go into our considerations, that alignment of charging infrastructure, you know, as in who has water meters, because going with Wellington, where that will be an ongoing concern and there's no solution in sight, as opposed to potentially the other councils to the north who are either in the process or planning to, apart from Manawatu, install water meters, then, you know, I think it's a consideration. Because one of the things that we found a little bit uncomfortable when Dougal came to speak to us was this idea that we'd have variable charging, how that would look, how complex that would be, how you work it out. Do we trust that that would happen effectively and accurately? So I think, the complexities around charging is probably something that needs to be factored in.
Charging and cost recovery as well, and our fair portion of that.
We've got it. Yeah, so I think it's...
So in the tables, I mean, you know,
Yes.
the traffic light tables, I think that should be aligned.
So
almost.
equity... So it's... Because what we're saying here in Kapiti is you pay for what you use.
Yeah.
We
And we can
recover the
measure it,
cost.
and we can measure it.
We measure it.
Yeah.
What the model at the moment looks like is, if you're a part of the Wellington seat, there is no you just get a lump sum charge based on a division of the total cost. So, you know, what's equitable about that in terms of how they're billing, and if they don't have meters, then they can't change that process. Whereas we have meters, so we can reflect that, depending on where you want to go with that, user pays approach to water, and you can use the same mechanism if you chose to for wastewater, in terms of what goes in and the percentage comes out. But without meters, you are not able to do that in that fairness, equitable way across the
In fact,
rest
actually,
of
if you take that a step
any of
further,
those models.
if you took that a step further, would it, if we joined, say, that Wellington entity, would they pretty much all stop using our meters? What would be the point? Because you basically...
I don't think we can answer
Yeah, no,
that
no, it's
question,
just a continuation.
I
Okay,
think
no,
you've
no.
raised a really good point, and we'll reflect it in the papers that we get.
Second one is when we led in last training, when we were leading into the what was potentially going to be the transfer of the assets, and our concern was the cross-subsidising aspect. We potentially brought projects forward so that they would be started before the process of transfer, if you like. It was a bit of a covering our bets sort of scenario. In other words, what we didn't want to do is have a couple of big projects that might have been dropped down to the bottom of the list if the whole asset base had been transferred out. That was a concern. I don't have any issue with that. It's not an issue with that. But is that one of the reasons why we've got a higher debt level in regards to the water space? We brought projects forward and started on them a bit earlier than we actually would have?
No, I think the consideration at the time was they need to be done now.
Yeah.
Deferring them any further is going to create risks for us.
Yep.
And if the entities do establish themselves, then the debt would be covered. So it wasn't that we brought them forward. The
idea was for it would go. It would go
stuck
out.
with the program.
You were made a decision to stick with what we needed to do because of the risks around not doing it, on the basis that obviously there's a need, but also that conversation about if these new entities do arrive, then they will take the debt anyway. So, but we didn't bring things forward. We stuck to the plan in terms of delivery, which is what we've done for the last sort of 10.
Okay, no, I was just curious about that. That was all. And the third thing was, it was just quite interesting when we talk about resilience, about those numbers, because we actually had people sleeping in our water space over COVID, didn't we?
Well, they did have a plan to convert the lab, I think, into a bedroom and a lounge out the back, but we didn't actually go. We didn't think that was a great idea. So, but that was the level of commitment they were prepared.
I know. I remember at the time.
But I didn't think that would be a great idea to have them cohabitating.
Okay, we're going to accelerate things because we want to have lunch and we're going to start the other briefing at 1:30. Sophie?
Yeah, pretty quick question. In terms of the development of the Water Services Delivery Plan and Implementation Plan, are we going to be waiting until the consultation finishes before we kind of start to pull that together? Because presumably we can kind of build the bones of it and then just plug in the model that we decide, and then let all of the implementation kind of flow from that decision.
It will.
Yeah, because that's what I'm looking at, is how long. Surely that's going to take longer than a couple of months to develop.
Well, we've been working on that to some extent. There are some fixed things you have to provide. What you're spending in those areas, what your assets look like. It's a combination of the asset management plans we have at the moment, taking out 10 years of the infrastructure strategy. There are a whole lot of requirements that we're already doing that need to form into this document. And then it's the implementation of it that is the model, and whether it's CCO or whatever it is, internal business unit. So most of it we hope we would have done.
Yep.
You do the consultation, then you lock in the final parts to it, and then it's completed. And whether our assumptions around establishment and things like that, we can we'll know what those numbers are, and it'll just be whatever model is chosen, then we plug those in. But it really is the referendum, the cost and time, as well as the consultation on the Act requires us to consult on a minimum of 2 options. So you then have to factor that into the timetable.
And one of them has to be internal business unit, status quo?
One of them has to be one of those 5.
Yeah.
Internal plus 1.
Yeah.
Internal plus 1 of 5, yeah. Okay, cool, thank you.
Last question, Liz.
It's not a question. You
Or
asked
comment, whatever you want.
Yeah, just you asked what other information do we need for the 28th. For me, none. I think it's quite clear that in terms of the decision we make on the 28th, that we should not go with Wellington, and I don't believe that option would be palatable to our community. So, yep, you're all good in terms of, yes, it might be predetermined, but I think it's, put it this way, we have enough information in front of us now.
That's better.
To be able to make that decision on an informed basis on the 28th. Thank you. Thank you for all the hard work.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Okay, yeah, thanks a lot. There's been a lot of work gone into this, and really good, strong, clear information that we have, and I think we all feel ready for this next stage ahead. And if there's anything else that we want to include in terms of decisions that councillors haven't been warned about, then we'll just flick around some information about that and make sure everybody's feeling comfortable. So thanks everybody. We'll see you back at 1:30. We're bringing the next thing forward from 2 to 1:30. Okay, so that's 23 minutes for lunch.